Hello, everybody. My name is Alan Greenberg. I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, and welcome to the Share TNC Lessons Learned and Looking Forward panel. We have a really great group of speakers, and so I'm excited. I get a pleasure of a dual role today, which is moderating this session and also speaking myself. Joining us are four people in total, speakers that is. My name is Alan Greenberg. I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, Office of Operations, and I do quite a lot of work in transport pricing and policy and have for some years. We're joined by Stanley Young from the National Renewable Energy Lab, Elizabeth Ervin from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Alistair Adams from Ridecell. And it's a really great panel. The folks here could talk about a lot of different things for a lot of time, but we've focused and narrowed what we're discussing today to looking at Share TNCs and its implications, and our last speaker will broaden that discussion a bit. So let me start by asking, in order of those who will be speaking, I'm first, but maybe we'll go to Stanley. You could say just a couple of things about what you're all working on and how this fits in, and then move on from there.
Okay, thank you. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Lab. I lead up the mobility systems team as part of a DOE effort that's looking into the energy impacts, not just of a vehicle powertrain or of a fuel, but the overall mobility transportation system. And as that, we've been looking into the impacts of ride sharing, ride hailing, and various other aspects, particularly as it contributes to, enables, and impacts the sustainability of urban transportation. And we have a presentation today that directs to a part of that related to ride hailing and the tendency to pool coming out of the data from the Chicago transit area.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth?
Hi, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Ervin. I work for the Union of Concerned Scientists. For those who aren't familiar with UCS, we are a national nonprofit that works to leverage science and analysis and data to solve the big problems we're facing as a nation and a world. And I work in our clean transportation program, and I focus on new mobility, so automated vehicles, ride hailing, thinking broadly about our transportation system and how do we take the steps we need to clean up our transportation system. And I'm going to talk in a bit about some of our research on the climate emissions impact of ride hailing.
Great. And then Alistair Adams from Ridecell, please.
Yeah, I'm Alistair Adams. I'm Director of Product Marketing at Ridecell. So at Ridecell, we provide platforms to enable companies to launch ride sharing and car sharing services. So I'll talk a little bit about our experiences there, and using my home city San Francisco as example, thinking about what are some of the alternative ways of reducing congestion due to the TNC companies. So I got a little presentation there with some interesting graphs and figures to provoke some thoughts and different ideas.
Great. And our organizers did say to leave plenty of time for interactions and Q&A. So we're gonna do our best to do that. All right. So I'm giving the first presentation here, and it's our research. It's on a similar order as the research that Stan's going to be talking about. But we specifically looked at some really good data that one TNC was very helpful in sharing with us or in allowing us to see. And now I'm going to share the screen. All right, let me just, you all see my screen or no? Not yet?
We can see it.
Oh, okay. So let me just go to this slideshow and then it's the full. Okay, here we go. Great. This is our standard disclaimer. Anytime we mention a company, it's for the purpose of our presentation and not to endorse any products. Before I sort of get to this slide, I just want to note that we have a program at Federal Highways called the Active Transportation Demand Management Program, and our objective is to maximize system efficiency and network efficiency, to balance supply and demand, to integrate traffic demand and parking management, and really to provide more choices and understand the choices that people are making. And this is part of sort of research in that area of understanding more that more of the decisions that people make. Why sharing? I think we all know this in this audience, so I don't really need to go through it, but obviously our road space is limited and there are lots of externalities with driving. And so sharing means that there should be reduced mileage and fewer externalities. We actually have a two-part study. I'm only focusing today on the latter. So we're obviously interested in trying to influence people who are driving alone and trying to figure out how to get them to share. We have some data, and part of our study relates to that, but I'm not discussing any of that today. The second part is probably the more exciting because we have some really good data, as I mentioned, and we're trying to figure out what influences people instead of choosing a private TNC trip to choose a shared trip. The terms ride hailing and ride sharing, they sometimes get used interchangeably. I don't. Ride sharing, we mean literally ride sharing. So it's non-private party trips. So that would be the Uber pool. Used to be called Lyft line, now it's shared Lyft and Via. The standard ride hailing products, the UberX, the standard Lyft, and also taxi, we don't consider those ride sharing. The study has three parts. I'm going to discuss part one and part three. We essentially do a lot of surveying and get some actual field data to understand the sharing behavior of people taking TNCs. We do something similar in a carpool, app-based carpool program. The data aren't as good, but they're still useful and interesting. Again, I'm not discussing that part of it, but it all feeds into a modeling and scenario analysis tool that we developed. I'll discuss the parts of the tool that relate just to the TNC policy analysis. And so here's our data. We survey users and ask them things like their trip purpose. We actually have data. We're focused on a trip that they just took, but we have a lot of additional data as well. We ask them questions we wouldn't otherwise know, like the purpose of the trip. We get a little bit more information about them personally and about their travel patterns. And then the TNC provided appended data that we add to this particular data set. A shout out, by the way, to our consulting team. It was led by ICF. And there's one of the sub-consultants, EBPUS, formerly EDR, Scott Middleton, kind of a lead on that. And he's actually in the chat space. So if something gets super, super technical, I mean, I know the study very well, but I'm not the one who actually played with the data. So Scott's the one who did that. So this is a kind of sample question that somebody may get. They will have taken one of these. Every question that they get related to the choices that we're asking them to make, one of those choices will always be the one that they made. And depending upon whether their last trip was shared or private, they will be faced with, over a series of few questions, either 9 or 11 different choices. And again, always in any 3-choice set will be the one that they just took. So we're trying to, it's a stated preference survey, but it's anchored off a revealed preference that they exhibit in a trip that they just took. So that's a good example of sort of what they would see. We surveyed 4,300, we got data on and surveyed 4,365 TNC users in 15 markets. 72% had the last trip was private, 28% was shared. Lots of ways to break down the numbers. So the dark blue is the frequent sharers, the lighter colors are the infrequent sharers. you should look sort of in each group. This is across the whole TNC population. So for instance, all the bars in the below 50,000 seem to be higher than the bars in the 100 to 150,000. That's just because the below 50,000 group is taking, at least from of those who took our survey, they're just taking more trips generally. And as you can see, they're much more frequent users of sharing. If you go to the far right, 150,000, they're much less frequent. But it's also worthy noting that people earning less often are not sharing, and people earning a lot sometimes do. So it's useful to see that. The sort of most extreme result is on the very top left, the employer paid trips. You can see that people are much more likely not to share those. But all of the trips are fairly similar in terms of sharing behavior. At larger parties, less so, a party of 2 or more. That makes sense because they give you a lesser discount if you're willing to share, and then you've also got someone else with you, and so there's maybe social pressure not to pick the less time efficient route for you. When we ask people why they chose a private ride, the top answer by far, and these add up to more than 100% because they could choose more than one, but the top answer by far was the uncertainty of the trip time. Then followed by it was being slower. Only 21 point something percent said they just didn't want to share with a stranger at all. And 20% of those, when we gave them 9 or 11 different choices over the course of multiple survey questions, 20% never chose a shared option. There's different visual presentations. I think I like the second one better. Basically, as the discount increases and the time penalty decreases, you get more sharing. And when you give small discounts and a fairly big time penalty, the amount of sharing is much less. Not surprising. Different groups, though, we did see this. The all is up top. What we're looking at here is if we added an additional $1 per mile, the average trip was a little over 6 miles. And this is the differential. If we increase the differential for private trips for shared trips by $1, we see that there was an 8.6% increase in sharing, but that's very different from different groups. So people, trips just in the downtown, unfortunately, very low sharing rates, and that's unfortunate because they're easier to match. Trips to airports, low sharing rates. Trips from work to elsewhere, people are quite willing to share, which is interesting. We did something where we looked at a time penalty. If you can somehow compress the time penalty for shared option here, we didn't see as much variation based on trip types and income and that sort of thing. So then we asked the question, well, what if you had a policy choice or desire to increase the proportion of sharing by 25%? So it went from about 30% to about 37.5%. What do the data tell you you'd have to do to achieve that? And the answer is you would either have to increase the per mile cost by almost $1.87, or you'd have to decrease the differential by 14 seconds a mile. And if you put the two together, you've got a time value of money of $231 per hour, which is a lot. That's not, again, some people don't share, so you have to be very careful not to say that's sort of what people are willing to pay. But that is, it suggests that time, doing something on the time side is more important than doing something on the money side. It's worth noting at the very bottom that certain types of trips, like those leaving from the office going elsewhere, people are much more price sensitive, and that's a time of day that you get a lot of congestion. So there are times that you might be more effective than at others to try some pricing mechanism. The next two slides are there. I'm not going to really go through them, other than to say there's a really unique thing where when we actually give people a choice on looking at just, if we observe choices just between shared options, that people's value of time actually seems to be much lower than suggested just a moment ago. So we would give people one price that would be lower for a trip that takes longer that's shared, and then another price that's higher for a trip that takes shorter. If their last trip was shared, then over half of them are suggesting a value of time of only $10.60 an hour. But if their last trip was private, the same proportion shows a value of time of almost $45 an hour. So the reason I say this is because it gives you some sense that there is definitely differences of values here. And so it's quite possible that perhaps a less efficient routing where you're doing a drop-off or a pickup that might not be the perfect order, but where one person's value of time is much higher than the other, could actually get people to share one. If you weren't sort of thinking of it in those terms, you wouldn't be able to get that other the person with a higher value of time be willing to share. Okay, so we have various conclusions. I'm going to skip through those. They're basically what I just said. I just want to show you the policy tool. Basically, you have you formulate various scenarios like the ones I just described, that change in the time or dollar differential between a private and shared options. We have a slider tool that lets you change those and see what its impacts are. The link on the very bottom allows you to get to that slider tool. And it also has some things for app-based carpooling, but I'm not focusing on that. I'm just looking at the TNC stuff for this particular presentation. As I noted, we're not specifying how the price difference grows or the time difference decreases. It could be anywhere from a whole range of different policies, whether it's tax policy, whether it's lane priority treatment, whether it's a TNC themselves choosing to have a try to increase the number of shared trips. They're all not doing this now, by the way, with COVID, but it's a very temporary stop, I think. It's worth noting that these services are sort of happening at the moment. You can use the model very specifically for different market segments and different city settings and so forth. So here's the slider tool. Here's what it looks like. If you slid the top one across, you would increase the cost savings to the TNC trip. So you could go to $1 or $2 or half $1 or whatever you want. You could also reduce the travel time. Again, they're both per mile variables. There are defaults. So we've chosen a market and we're doing that. And we've chosen a population segment and we're doing that as well. And then there are defaults that you can change, but they're based on research. So there's a certain overlap rate for trips that are shared. So a good portion of those trips, even though people selected a shared option, there's just one person in the vehicle or one party at a time. And then TNCs have, unfortunately, a lot of deadhead miles, and we have the default in there too. If you wanted to envision a policy that would have impact these, you could change these defaults as well. One thing that's, so this is that particular scenario we just ran, $1 per mile increase San Francisco for trips starting in the office districts, but it's regional. If you go to the third and fourth rows, you'll see that the initial share goes from 1% private and 0.6% shared to a much larger 0.9% share. It's almost a 50% increase, and then a reduction of the private from 1% to 0.7%. So that's pretty significant. But if you go to the very bottom, you're actually only impacting or reducing 0.2% of the trips. This is in the region. If you were concerned just downtown, you would get a much higher number. And so, you can do externality. Delucci has these sort of externality calculations based on reduced mileage. They're kind of general. They're nationwide. Probably in a city, the externality is much higher, but this is just sort of and tool you can use for that purpose. And that's my presentation. I think the plan is to kind of run through the presentations and open it up there. I'll take a look in the chat box as well. But I think Stanley has a really sort of good follow-on to this. And so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Alan, real quick, we had a question in the chat. Is there any data on private carpooling from Facebook groups, et cetera?
Yes, it's not the, so part of our study is looking at app-based carpooling and incentives because we're trying to figure out how that impacts people's choices. Obviously, there's a lot of data on HOV lanes impacts on carpools. In terms of sort of the unique data that we got, though, it's just even that portion of our research that we're looking at, the app-based carpooling data, it wasn't specified for a purpose. They were just data that were out there that was sort of close. So yeah, there are some data on that. It's not as good as I'd like it to be, and we're working with some companies. Metropia had some data set, and they're a subcontractor. We're looking at their data. There's some other firms, there's Hitch and some others that have been playing with incentives, and we're going to look a little bit more closely at that as well. All right, I have to figure out how to unshare my screen here. Okay, but okay. I'm having some issues. You all still see my screen, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, Alan, if you press that, there you go.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't get that.
I have power over it. I can click you off.
Okay, you can do that. All right, okay. All right, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. This is Stan Young from National Renewable Energy Lab. I'm presenting some material that was originally presented at the TRV meeting earlier this year. There's the list of authors: Yi, Manu, Dustin, Alejandro, Matt, and Josh. And notice my name isn't on there. I get to present it. When this was originally scheduled, I was the only one available to travel, and as a result, get this here today. But nonetheless, this is a good set of work. I tried to cull down the slides a little bit to stay within 10 minutes and just hit the highlights. Alan, that was a great introduction. I was comparing your statistics to these statistics as we're going through, and they look very similar. Now, if I can get the page down to work. Okay, our basic question was what factors might influence a customer's propensity to pool in a transportation network company trip or ride-hailing trip. Now, understand that there's the two things. When you call for the trip, you'll say, I am willing to accept a shared ride with a stranger or strange party. And then there's the actual matching. Sometimes you request the pool and you get to ride alone as well. The data set we used is a recent data set. It comes in April of 2019 from Chicago. Many of you are probably very familiar with this, and a good portion of you probably have run some analysis on this. It reflects trip, vehicle, and driver data associated with citywide TNC, about 45 million trips, 5 million records related to vehicles, and about 5 million records related to drivers. A very rich data set in order to mine this. This work focuses on trip tables for Chicago between November 2018 and April 2019. It had the start and end timestamps. It had trip fare, duration and distance, pickup, drop-off, census tract, and then the trip pooling factor, whether they were willing to accept the ride and whether they were actually matched. If you take a look at the numbers down there, the number of trips, again, about 45 million. It was not a very clean data set. They went through and they just ran some sanity checks on the numbers. So after they applied all the appropriate filtering to get out the records, we get down to about 38 million for an average trip distance of 4.67 miles in 16 minutes, which isn't very fast, but it is 17.5 miles an hour, which is a pretty good clip if you had to ride a bicycle. We looked at 3 basic factors in this analysis for the willingness to pool: trip-specific factors, how long it was, the duration, temporal, time of day, things like that, and location-based, where people live, the location of where they're going, and so forth. This is very at the top level. If you take a look across the x-axis, it reflects the duration of the data from November of 2018 through up until about April of 2019. And that sawtooth pattern there, if you look at it, those are weekly cyclic patterns of people willingness to pool, which is 23.7%. That means about 24% of people, when they call an Uber or Lyft or Via, they said, hey, I'm willing to pool with somebody else. Of those 23.7%, 72% of that was actually matched with another rider. So in aggregate, about 18% effective total pooling out of a willingness of about 23.7. All the statistics we're going to show from this point out has more to do with that. Of the 23.7%, what are the characteristics that they were wanting willingness to pool? Here's the methodology and results. We applied actually 2 different methods. The first one we're going to present is the multiple linear regression, a very classic statistical-based approach where you take the willingness to pool ratio and make it a linear combination of a constant plus a multiplicative factor by various other items. And then later we applied a machine learning technique, a tree learning method, and we'll compare and contrast the results. The basic top level to share the results is they were both highly in agreement with each other, except one was probably a heck of a lot more efficient to operate if you had a good machine learning person. Both models assess the relevance to 10 factors to explain the difference: the duration and distance of the trip, weekend versus weekday, time of day, average % difference in fares, shared versus private trips, whether it's an airport trip or not, the median income of the rider, the population density both at the pickup and drop off, as well as job density, and then also the weather. This kind of cuts straight to the results. If you take a look, and this is just for the regression results, if you like the statistics, we got the t-value there, and then the estimate and some of the insights involved. The most significant on whether it was a trip to the airport or not, if it was a trip to the airport, a large negative factor means people don't want to pool. Not unsurprising, very time critical. If you're late at all or have a delay, then that gets you into trouble. If you take a look at the income at the drop-off and income at the pickup, those were also very highly relevant variables, so as determining whether you're willing to pool or not. Unfortunately, my monitoring window is over that. I was comparing this to some of Alan's numbers. For every 10,000 increase in median income, there was a 1.67 decrease in the willingness to pool. So that kind of directly reflects the value of time proposition that's presented to people. This is one of my favorite charts to show. On the left and right, you got to slow down and understand it. On the left is a plot of the average willingness to pool by census tract, of course, the light yellow being highly probable to pool. And then on the right is the average income by census tract, and at the top in yellow is the higher income. And in your mind, if you one is the transpose of the other, more or less. So it tells you the direct relationship as far as an economic factor. We reran it, and in fact, there's several other insights, and I encourage you to either drop me an email or contact directly one of the authors. They'd love to talk to you in more detail, share the paper and everything. We redid the analysis using a machine learning technique. It's called XGBoost. It's one of the machine learning tree algorithms. Not to go into detail, the advantage is it's much quicker. You don't need a lot more prep. Some of the disadvantages is you don't have the intuitive feel sometimes that you get with some of the classical statistical regression methods. And if you're using it on linear models, be careful that you don't extrapolate beyond the ends. In other applications, we ran into that and it kind of bit us a couple of times. So there's pluses and minuses. It's really hard to beat the efficiency of some of the new machine learning methods, though. And this summarizes it in one slide. And if I knew how to move the monitor out of the way, there we go. On the left is the linear regression, and on the right is the XGBoost. Oops, I went too far. And if you just go down in the rank order, the linear regression uses the estimated coefficient. The XGBoost has a built-in method to say, here are the order of the variables and their most importance. And for the most part, they line up. At the top of the list is airport pickup and drop off, and then the income is way up there as well, as far as influencing factors. We did some model verification. I always like looking at the residual plots. If you take a look at the linear regression model, it fits pretty well. We have a mean absolute error on our test data set of about 7.9%, and they cluster well around the 45-degree line. And then you go over to what we call the XGBoost, the machine learning tree algorithm, and we're getting errors down in the 4.6 range. So we're pleased with that. Conclusions. About 18% total effective pooled rate in Chicago based on about a 24% willingness to pool. Learning factors, some of the factors that make a pool, when we understand that, just as with Alan saying, what are the levers? The levers are time, the levers are money, of course, but also understand that the variability, the travel time reliability has been a big factor in a lot of the FHWA USDOT work over the last decade, and that also plays into TNC and ride-hailing, and need to be cognizant of that. Also, this could play into policy. Once you understand the sensitivity, as Alan shared, of time versus money, you begin to shape more effective programs around it. My last slide was future research, and these are all great points, and you're welcome to look over them. But this was all written in January for TRB, so the overriding one right now is forget all that. What impact does COVID-19 disease transmission have on willingness to pool and moving forward? In short, we've been looking across the whole spectrum, any type of shared mobility, be it transit, be it TNCs, be it airlines, anything that puts you into a vehicle or a cabin of any sort with somebody you're not familiar with. There's a lot of fear out there. So I think all those long-term research objectives have been replaced with short-term research objectives that are saying, how do we, how is this going to rebound? Are there going to be some inelastic rebounds? Is there anything the DOE lab complex can do to help restore some of the confidence in shared mobility resource, not only for energy efficiency, but for many people, shared resources, be it transit or private, are the only means of transportation. So that's taken front and center right now. And that's all I had. Thank you for your time.
Great. Shall we move on to Elizabeth?
We've got some,
okay.
some questions.
Okay.
And so first, Ellen from SumC asked if there's any relationship between willingness to pay and transit usage.
I'll be up for, that's for Alan. Go ahead.
Well, maybe you have, I don't think you did surveying. So well, you can tell me, but I'll give a shot. We certainly know about willingness to pay and their propensity to share, not surprisingly. And I showed one slide where those who had shared in their last trip were willing to pay a little bit over $10 an hour to save time, versus those who had not shared in the last trip demanded about $45 an hour. And I don't know if you have any other thing there.
With respect to transit, ours was a data set, and the most we could possibly do, and I'll take this back to authors, is we had the beginning and ending points down to the census tract level, I believe. And so if we could correlate like the census tract to major boarding points for a metro or rail, then we could possibly run that. But short of that, we did not look into that in our analysis.
All right.
Sorry, Ellen was asking about willingness to pool and transit relationship.
Oh, sorry. I said that P was in economics parlance is normally willingness to pay. I'm trying to think whether Scott Middleton may know. I don't recall. Well, wait a minute. We had, yes, we did actually have people who were more frequent transit riders were more willing to pool. And it was, I didn't show that, but there was a question about transit frequency. I could try to find the direct number, but yes, there is that relationship. It's not surprising if you're willing to be in a transit vehicle with others, you're probably also willing to be in a private car with others as well.
Okay, 2 more questions. For Stanley, Andrea asks, might your model suffer from the ecological fallacy model with regard to income? You have aggregate income information, but the analysis uses it for an individual propensity to share. I would urge more caution using it and interpreting this variable.
Yeah, I'll take that back to the authors. I know they correlated the spatial areas to known socioeconomic factors. I'm pretty sure they did that and connect the two, and they can have a deeper discussion on how that was done.
Okay, two more. Matt asks, might have missed this, but on average, how much longer are pooled rides, and how does that align with perceived time penalty?
Well, it varies. I mean, we surveyed within the range that would be commonly seen. So we tried not to do surveying outside of what was what someone would see, because wouldn't be very practical. So we surveyed a range of time increase of 35% on the low end to 75% on the high end. No, actually, I misspoke. That's actually the price. Let me look again here, because I did. I now realize I misspoke on that one. We surveyed. I will tell you that in a second. Oh yeah. So we surveyed anything from a travel time increase of nothing, and even there, we got 20% never choosing a pooled option, to anything upwards of 165%. So a 65% increase in the trip time.
Okay, Stan, and this one's a little more specific. Someone asked if you could go back and show the slide with the study details in the beginning.
Okay, let me share the screen. Is this it?
I'm not sure. There's not many more details in the question.
I will say, who's ever asking that, all the slides will be made available, I understand. So I know both Stan and I had to sort of fly through some. But if it's just to see a slide rather than to ask a question about it, maybe we should move on.
Okay.
But yes, we all flew through our slides, and there's plenty of data in there. So that's a good break for questions, because Stan and I sort of did, our studies are of a similar nature. I think Elizabeth, and I know that you kind of step back and try to look at the broader implication of all this. So we had a pleasant few opportunities to talk about it, and so I welcome your sharing your insights with everybody here today.
Thanks so much. I'm going to get my screen set up here. I think this will work. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. I'm really happy to be here. It's great to hear about other people's research, and it's making me think about some of the implications of, and I'm looking forward to the discussion because I think it'll be cool to talk about how all of our research interacts. So the report that I want to talk about a little bit really quickly today, so we can get to the discussion and questions, is a report that UCS wrote looking at the climate impacts of ride hailing. As Alan said, sort of taking a bit of a step back from the research that we've heard about already, and looking at sort of what does ride hailing mean for climate emissions and right now, and what could it mean in the future if we do a better job of getting people to share, if we do a better job of electrifying and reducing some of those other factors that affect TNC emissions. So if I can get my slides to advance, here we go. I mentioned UCS. We're a whole bunch of data and analysis nerds trying to do a deep dives into topics and try to identify solutions that can make for a healthier planet and a safer world. And I explained a little sort of where this research came from. We wanted to look into the factors driving TNC emissions today and going into the future. So just to walk through our top level findings, there's much more detail in our full report, which is available on our website. But we found when you compare a private vehicle to non-pooled ride hailing, the non-pooled ride hailing trip actually emits 47% more than a comparable private vehicle trip. And that is because of that dashed part of the bar is the deadheading miles. So those are the miles between trips, the miles that a driver drives on their way to pick you up. All those additional miles add up to a lot of additional emissions. When we look at pooled ride hailing, we find that pooling essentially eliminates the climate disadvantage of ride hailing compared to private vehicles. The other thing I'll just note is that you'll see here that actually the blue bar for non-pooled ride hailing, those are the sort of emissions of the vehicle itself. And what we found in looking at data from California is that ride-hailing vehicles tend to be more efficient than your average private vehicle. So pooling has a big impact on emissions compared to non-pooled ride-hailing, but still we're on par with a private vehicle trip. So what do we need to do to really drive down emissions from ride-hailing? And that's where we start to combine both electric and pooling. So when we looked at the emissions of combining, you can see that an electric pooled ride-hailing trip can cut emissions by 68% compared with a private vehicle trip. So that's a huge potential emissions reduction. But of course, people aren't just replacing private car trips with ride-hailing trips. They're replacing other modes. And this gets to actually a question that someone asked around willingness to pool and transit. It's kind of the inverse of that question, which is that people taking pooled rides are more likely to be replacing trips by lower emission modes. We found that about 36% of pooled rides are replacing bus or rail or walking or biking or not taking a trip at all. So once you factor in the emissions of those other modes, this is our sort of summary graphic here. We found that the typical ride-hailing trip is about 69% more emissions than the trip that it's displacing. And for the typical ride-hailing trip, we used about 15% of the trips being pooled trips and the rest being non-pooled trips. But when you look out into the future, if you have more electrification and more pooling. So if you increase that rate from 15% to 50% pooling, and you get more electric vehicles out there on the roads in ride hailing, you can see a 52% decrease compared to a displaced trip from ride hailing. So that gives you a sense of the opportunity out there. And I just wanted to take a second to talk about sort of what are the pathways to get us to that better future. And there are a number of them. So one is setting standards. A great example of this is an ongoing regulatory process in California, which is requiring the Air Resources Board and the Public Utilities Commission to implement a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from TNCs. And they're still in the process of developing this regulation, but the goal is that it allows companies to use a variety of strategies, from reducing deadheading, increasing pooling rates, and increasing electrification to meet this goal. So that really helps create a market where, or a standard to start, a framework to move forward and really make some big progress. Some other things that I'm sure lots of folks are familiar with. This is a photo from the announcement in Denver of Lyft putting 200 Kias into service, partnering with Electrify America to provide charging access to drivers who are leasing electric vehicles to get them into the fleet. And part of the reason that this worked was because the state legislature expanded the state's tax credit program to allow fleet operators to take advantage of those tax credits. So this is an example of, the need for the whole ecosystem, from the private companies, the charging companies, drivers, and government, all to work together to figure out sort of what will it take to get more EVs on the road and more folks sharing rides. Obviously, it's critically important to keep investing in our transit system, and now even more than ever, as folks who were listening in on the panel this morning, heard lots of folks talking about, keeping the backbone of our shared mobility system strong, so that we're not, looking back to the survey of who is choosing a pooled ride, that it's not just pulling folks off of transit into a pooled ride, but really making transit and ride hailing and pooled service all work together to get more people out of private cars. And then the last thing that I think someone already mentioned, is fee structures that help incentivize, and this is where we get into some of the relationships between some of the previous research that folks were talking about, the time and cost incentives that can help influence consumers to pick a shared option. And this is Chicago's new fees that went into effect in January that have lower fees for pooled trips, particularly pooled trips that start or end outside of the downtown zone. So that was my quick presentation. I tried to get through it all pretty quickly so we can get to our last presentation and discussion, but looking forward to answering questions later.
Hey, so one question that came up, someone asked if the Denver launch was sustainable long-term. I'm assuming that's means funding.
I don't know the answer to that question. Obviously, that launch, they announced it in, I think, November. And so certainly there's a lot that's changed in that world since November. I think that, figuring out how do you get drivers into rental vehicles is something that the industry as a whole is sort of wrestling with. With Maven recently stopping its rental business. So I think there's some questions out there, but I think it's a key way to get folks into EVs who might not be able to afford the upfront costs, who may not be ready for a long-term commitment, to get folks a chance to try it out. So that's an area that we're really interested in thinking about. How do we make that market sustainable?
Okay. There's one more. Wouldn't the incentive for downtown rather than outside downtown areas be better?
Sorry, was that question about, I can put my slide back up again. Hang on here. Let's do this here. So were you asking about, so basically the cost is least for trips outside of downtown. This is really intended to be a congestion pricing measure as well, first and foremost. So they were really targeting higher fees on trips that started or ended in the downtown area for the higher fees. And this is partially an equity issue. This is back to the map that I think Stanley was showing earlier. You see a lot more pooling happening in low-income neighborhoods, and a lot more pooling happening in low-income neighborhoods that maybe don't have as great access to the transit system in Chicago. So I actually only started at UCS in January, but before that I was working for the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and we did some research looking at how costs would change under this fee based on where folks were going, taking TNC trips, and really it showed that part of the function of this fee structure was to keep costs lowest in low-income neighborhoods. So there was an equity piece to this analysis too. I personally think based on some of the research that Alan and Stanley have done, it would be interesting to see how much it would affect behavior to charge a fee on the origin and the destination. So seeing whether, if you are starting and ending in the downtown area that tend to have great transit service, would that induce more people to pool or to take other alternatives?
Elizabeth, I can't find, I'll have to look for this, but I remember reading a very interesting study of ride-hailing trips that started in a transit info app. So people had that's where they went first. And that was pretty instructive because those were trips that presumably people wanted a transit alternative. Otherwise, if you just wanted to go to Uber or Lyft, you'd just presumably go to Uber or Lyft. And it did show, it wasn't surprising, but late night kind of things. There were times you would see that people were definitely taking advantage of the TNC stuff. I remember seeing a study in Boston also where some very low income people do use TNCs, and some of them were actually getting free transit. So there are definitely, people have all sorts of constraints that are very real, even if their incomes are low. And anyway, no, your presentation was great. A lot of sort of food for thought on putting this together and what does it really mean in a big picture kind of way if you're thinking holistically, whether it's for congestion or climate emissions reductions or whatever. Pete, is that it for the questions there?
Yeah, no more.
Okay, great. Well, let's, I think, and Alistair from Ridecell, as we too had some nice and interesting discussions. We've been in this space for a while and been thinking big thoughts and really have some really good insights from trying to implement things over your career. So go to it.
Yeah, okay, one more. Someone's asking, what's the definition of a replaced trip? Was that a private vehicle trip, a weighted average of vehicle and transit trips? That's a good question.
So the displaced trips, it was a weighted average of based on the mode split and the climate emissions of those various modes. Happy to, on our website, there's a whole bunch more information and a much deeper dive into all the methodologies.
Okay, so as you said, I'm Alistair Adams. Very fascinating presentation so far. I'm going to take a slightly different track since we're doing less on the direct ride sharing at the moment. So I'll just move on with that. Just a little bit about Ridecell, and our sort of tagline is that what we do is we enable customers to launch and run high growth and sustainably profitable mobility services. And I think the key there I just want to emphasize is sustainability and profitability. Sorry, sustainable, profitable, because many of the mobility services that are operating right now are not profitable. So we put a lot of focus on thinking about how things can be more profitable. So a bit about Ridecell. Been around since 2009. We're based out of San Francisco. But what I really want to just highlight is the last green bullet point, that back in 2013, we actually operated a rideshare service called Summon, which was the very first ride-sharing service in California to be licensed. Unfortunately, the mistake that our founders did was they tried to focus on how do we make this ride-sharing profitable, whereas Uber and Lyft were doing a land grab to try and get as much market share as they can, and the rest is history. But just keep that point in mind, because I'll come back to that. Just quickly, just know what we're doing. So clearly we have a platform that does ride sharing, doing on-demand and scheduled rides, or pooled or dedicated. But also we branched out, and we also have a car sharing platform, and we're powering, for example, in the East Bay, there's a big car share company, and they're using our platform. And we do all types of car sharing. So the free floating, where you've got the car sitting around the city, you pick up your car, you drive to wherever you want, and then when you finish your rental, you just leave it at the side of the road. And then you have the station-based, which is more like what Zipcar sort of pioneered, where you book it ahead of time for a set amount of time, and then when you're finished, you have to take it back to where you got it from. And that model actually enables you to do things like residential car sharing or corporate car sharing. And then now that we're hitting the post-COVID world, what about touchless test drives and rentals of vehicles? So we have the tool sets to allow all these different models. But let's come back to what the problem statement was, and that is that the TNCs are increasing the congestion in cities. And living in San Francisco, we've definitely seen that, and a lot of reports were based on San Francisco data. And so clearly what we've heard today is how do you encourage pooled rides. So what I thought I'd do is let's just talk about, well, what are some of the alternative mobility options around there? But maybe I think we should set some context and just see how we got there. So if you remember at the beginning, I talked about how we were trying to make our Summon service profitable, and then here we are, well, 6 years later, Uber and Lyft, they're still losing a lot of money about it. So what that means that each ride is effectively subsidized by some venture capital money, and they've almost killed the taxi business. But having said that, it's a much more pleasant ride in Uber and Lyft than it was in the old-fashioned taxis, and when they're coming, so there's a much better user experience. But also these subsidies are also suppressing other modalities such as car sharing, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So a huge cost for Uber and Lyft was a driver, and to get around that, especially if you read a lot of stuff in the press, the bet was that autonomous vehicles will save that cost. And a few years ago, everyone was predicting autonomous is going to be around in 2020. So here we are in 2020, and not a lot's happening. And everyone's now saying, well, actually 2030 is more realistic. So that kind of means that they're scrambling a little bit for their plan B. And so what Uber's doing, they're branching out to delivery service. And they also bought Jump Bikes, which is a dockless e-bike service. So that's kind of interesting, which brings me to the first alternative mobility, and that's sort of micromobility. And this is a study that Santosh Rao, who's a policy expert from Uber, wrote in a Medium post. I got the quote, the link at the bottom of the slide here. And he was looking at how did the frequency of Uber and Lyft jumps change when they actually created an app that had both Jump and Uber all in one app, so that you could choose one or the other depending on your trip. And what they found was that it actually increased 15%, and but then the entire increase was actually attributed to the use of e-bikes, and the actual Uber trips declined by 10%. So what they're showing, and I believe this is San Francisco data, is that having alternatives like jump routes can actually reduce the usage of dedicated single-use Uber rides. And it's kind of interesting just looking at this graph here that predominantly most of the jump bike usage is done during the day, and then the evenings are switching back to Uber rides, which is sort of what you'd expect. So I find that really interesting. Let's move on. But then as we bring in more micromobility, I'm sure everyone's heard and seen all the headlines that's saying, all right, the scooter injuries are exploding. And everyone talks about, all right, we need to put helmets in there and scooters need to be better designed, bikes need to be better designed or whatever. But very few people talk about infrastructure. But this is actually where the street blocks are saying, yeah, we do actually need to talk about infrastructure. So just to give you some anecdotal stories, I'm a hardcore bicyclist. Not much phases me when I'm out biking on the streets until I started working in San Francisco, and it can get pretty scary. I'm riding around there, I'm an experienced bike rider, and I see all these people on e-bikes and e-scooters. They're total neophytes trying to navigate heavy, busy traffic, city traffic on two-wheelers. And I'm just cringing at what I see there. And then you sort of wonder, is it any wonder that they're filled with scooter injuries? And they go down in their article and they show, well, here are the number of protected bike lanes that they have. They're gradually increasing over time. And they map that to the number of shared micromobility trips. And you can see there's a big explosion in 2018, but the number of protected bike lanes isn't increasing. And just looking around, you're starting to see in San Francisco, yes, they're taking lanes out. They're adding more dedicated bike lanes, and that's going to help. So what makes me think is that we're going to get to this sort of virtuous circle like here, where you're seeing more people who are using micromobility. That means that the cities are getting more pressure to actually put in more bike lanes and putting roads on road diets, which in turn is going to mean there's going to be less lanes, which means there's going to be more car congestion. And when you're sitting in your car, it's not moving anywhere, and you see all these bikes and scooters going past you, you're going to think, maybe I should be using those next time. And so I was just talking about this with my boss this morning. He said, yeah, that's exactly what I did. I was sitting there and everyone was going by me, and I just got myself an e-bike. So, I think that this is going to be one solution for the very dense inner cities of getting more people out of cars altogether. Now, clearly it depends on the city and the dynamics, and they might not work in Chicago in the middle of winter, but there's certainly potential there. So that brings me on to the next one, which is car sharing. Lovely study done by Vancouver City. That basically said that people loved it because they liked the convenience of just getting in and going whenever they needed a car, when it was there, that it saved them money because they didn't own their own car. They actually found that they were driving less and instead they were walking more, which actually kept them healthier. And having the option of a car share to come home at night actually made them feel safer. So there's definitely a place for there. It's interesting that Vancouver is actually the most successful place in North America for car sharing. And what's interesting to note there is that until just the turn of the year, Uber and Lyft were actually not allowed to operate there. And so there was less price competition from a subsidized business for fares. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes there. But I just thought that's really interesting as an alternative for people to get around. More studies that talked about car sharing is that it actually removes more personal vehicles from the streets. So people are actually more likely to give up their vehicle. We have a lot of people saying, well, Uber and Lyft are claiming people give up their ownership. But also what they're doing is any vehicles that people have given up have gone to other people who are now driving for Uber and Lyft. And in turn, there are also studies showing that these are reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And then this was one I thought was particularly interesting, is looking at the number of vehicle miles traveled. Elizabeth talked a lot about deadhead miles. I think her percentage was even higher, but yes, you've got a lot of deadhead miles when you're taking a rideshare vehicle. But if you could solve the parking problems which is really a policy thing in cities, and have some people do some of these as car sharing, you're going to have less deadhead miles available there because you just stop when you've gone there. So now it becomes a trade-off between, does the city want to have more parking available for car share operators versus does the city want to tolerate ride hailing companies having their cars doing deadhead mile circling in their streets? So these are kind of interesting policy decisions. And then one more, we actually did a little study of how much it actually costs to get around. So as I mentioned, Gig Car Share is one of the companies, operators that we power. And so we just took a trip and just looked at the different costs. So it actually turns out that Gig is by far quite a bit cheaper than everybody else. And looking at these different prices. Now clearly the advantage of a ride hailing is that you don't have to worry about where you park the car at the end of the day. And again, that comes back to what I said earlier is, how does the city want to treat the policy of tolerating car share companies inside the city? And just for people who don't know, in San Francisco, they don't actually have a true free floating service. They do on the East Bay, but in San Francisco, what Gig ended up doing was doing deals with surface parking lots. And so they could have 2, 3, 4 cars in all these different surface parking lots, and there's about a dozen scattered around the city. So it is possible to start a journey on the East Bay and end it in San Francisco and just leave the car there, and vice versa. So yeah, it's just my presentation. So thanks for that, and I think we can go over to questions.
I want to thank you, Alistair. Any just thoughts as to, the market has moved in a particular way where there was a lot of excitement about sort of traditional car sharing and then one-way car sharing, and a lot of them have struggled. One-way car sharing, the two big outfits have sort of left North America. And TNCs have been very dominant in this space, but now we've got some rates have been going up because there's a push for profitability. Any sort of, if you're kind of looking forward, do you think we're going to see car sharing sort of grow back again? Or, it's hard to sort of predict these things, obviously, but you've been in this space for a while and you've been watching it for a while. So.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the city policies and the incentives, or sometimes the disincentives that people put in play. In fact, actually, there's one slide. Maybe if I showed you that, it would give you an idea. Let me just share that one more time. It comes down to the parking and the charges that the cities have, how much they make it available. As I mentioned, you can't really do I find that you can't do total free floating in the city streets. But here's just an example of the policy impact for parking a car. So you've got a vast change between Washington D.C., which is charging almost $3,000 for a car sharing permit, and the typical revenue you get from a rented vehicle is on the order of about $12,000 a year. That's across most rental services. And so you see that's a huge chunk of money that you're taking out of it. So it makes it really hard to become profitable. And if you take this all the way down to Madrid, where it's zero, where we also operate a car sharing service, and plus they made incentives to such that electric vehicles could come into the city center, whereas ICEs couldn't. So that's made it really work really well. And in fact, there are 4 car share operators, 4 or 5, I believe, in Madrid, who are all competing very successfully and doing well to run their services. So it can be done, but it requires a will. But then again, you've also got the problem with America's a different culture. The cities are much more spread out, and you got to change people's attitude towards owning a car as well, which takes time. I think there was one other, this was talking about policy impact in Toronto, where they started excluding the parking permit for car-to-go. And, that basically just ended up driving car-to-go out of Toronto. So, a lot of this is just policy decisions by city. And then again, you've also got problems with people in the US think it's their right to the street outside, the outside the house is their right to park. And if you see anybody else's vehicle out there, you get upset. And I think that's also something that has to change the mindset.
So,
yeah, I was gonna, are you reading the same thing I am?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually had some more questions of my own, but a really good one came up. And so it's breaking news. California is suing Uber and Lyft, saying employees are being misclassified. I'm curious how we may revision. So it says revision, but re-envision this service to better serve everyone, including drivers. Anyone want to offer up predictions or share why they think something would work better? So, so just stepping back a little bit, we have what we have. Then we've got COVID, and then we also have this whole question of reclassifying drivers. I think to me, I'll make a quick comment on just the, I mean, to the degree that they do that, it probably makes, essentially would require a higher level of compensation, I would imagine. So that would make Uber and Lyft trips probably more expensive. I do think there are potential ways that the companies might be able to get around some of this, and who sort of wins that, I don't know. But I think if those services become more expensive, then I think alternatives become a little bit more, in a relative sense, desirable. And they could be alternatives on the same platform. You noted, for instance, that when Jump joined the Uber platform in San Francisco, it increased the overall platform bookings, but decreased the regular Uber booking. And you can envision also with shared, if the price goes up generally, people might, at least from our data, and also I'm sure from Stanley's data, it suggests that people might, would be more inclined to share. Others can sort of weigh in on that if you'd like.
Yeah, I just think that, yeah, you're going to have these regulations. You're going to have this battle between trying to make life better for the drivers, and the other companies are going to fight back or trying to work workarounds. And I sometimes worry that when you bring in a lot of regulations, you end up with unintended consequences. But I don't know if there's an easy solution to this. And it's going to, if drivers get paid more, it's going to push the prices up. And will people be as willing to use the services when the prices go up and go back to more public transport? And eventually, at some point, they've got to stop losing money and make money.
Ellen asked, isn't there a large network effect where there has to be a sufficient density of car sharing cars that you don't have to walk far to find one?
Yeah, there does. Yes, and we do a lot of that. And that's part of, when I said, we spend a lot of time looking to see how you can make these services profitable. And so increasing utilization is a key part of that, making sure the car's in the right place. So, applying machine learning to where people want demand and where the supply needs to go. So yeah, that's one of the things that they need to do, is make sure the vehicle's in the right place. And that's a big part of the operational costs.
I have a quick question just for Elizabeth and Stanley. How do you decide what to study when everything is sort of, and then we even have a question on that's come up just now. So everyone agrees we need more pool rides. Is that feasible in the age of COVID? Which is sort of a large question. My instinct is that people will be maybe leaving even denser and bigger modes for less dense modes, and there's a limit to sort of car parking in downtown. So something sort of has to give, is my instinct to that one. But more broadly, and you're welcome to sort of weigh in on that, but more broadly, when you're sort of watching chaos, which is, this marketplace has been chaotic for a long time, how do you decide, hey, what's relevant? What should I study? What do I really need to weigh in on?
I'll take a shot at that. Realize that we're sponsored by the Department of Energy, specifically out of the Vehicle Technologies Office, and their goal for a long time has been energy independence, energy security, and now with the most recent concerns, sustainability with respect to emissions of various sorts. And their game is usually a long game. So they got involved in the mobility aspect primarily out of the concern with the technology is changing so rapidly. Are our investments in fuel economy and drivetrain economy, you know, are we going to rush past that so fast that we're going to create a quagmire? And so keep in mind the motivation is both with respect to energy and sustainability, but they also acknowledge coming in that there's some stress points in our mobility system, particularly in urban areas, that we're just not doing a great job of connecting people to what they need to be connected with in an efficient way. You know, they keep track of congestion as well because it diminishes travel time and fuel economy. And so with respect to that, that's why they're looking at the ride-hailing industry saying, hey, this is something new. It caught on really fast. You know, what happens when vehicles start driving themselves, when the automation is mature? Is our VMT going to go through the roof, or are we going to adopt new styles of life? As you said, it's chaos. I like to say it's uncertainty. You know, they're monitoring it closely because if there's opportunities to leverage it to more an energy sustainable future, that's where the DOE is going to be, but also to nudge it to better mobility. We've done a lot of work in saying what is good mobility, how do you measure good mobility. It has a lot of parallels to accessibility theory and working in all those spaces.
Yeah. So coming from a slightly different perspective in that Union of Concerned Scientists, we're a nonprofit. We've been around for about 40 years, working on a variety of issues. You know, the transportation team has a long history of working on fuel efficiency, you know, reducing the carbon intensity of fuels, and sort of trying to look at all the issues around electric vehicles and how to get more electric vehicles in the fleet. But it's really clear, even before COVID hit, you know, that the transportation system is changing really rapidly, and there's a need to think about how all of these things are affecting our thinking about the system as a whole. And I think now more than ever, the choice of what to research and what to focus on is not only a sort of the urgent concerns around sustainability and climate change, but also the really clear equity implications of all of these technologies and the way that our mobility system is working. And the question about sort of the gig worker, the gig economy, and how our transportation system is affecting both the users and also the sort of providers of these services. We did another research paper a little before I was back at UCS, but I was a reviewer on it, looking at automated vehicles and what impact automated vehicles might have on the transportation system, and particularly for low-income neighborhoods, for communities of color. This is the moment where we really need to have those concerns at the forefront. I think there was a question earlier in the chat about people with disabilities as well. You know, making sure that we're designing a system that works well for the people who haven't been well designed for yet, and making sure that those folks are part of the conversation and part of the research. So that's what we're going to continue to do, and continue to, as we continue to research these topics going forward.
Great. I did see something in the chat pod about whether the nonprofit model makes a difference. You know, some of these very specific questions I haven't been involved in researching. I don't recall in your research, Elizabeth, anything to that level of sort of, my recollection is you've been more outcome focused than sort of, am I right about that?
We didn't get into sort of business models. Just off the top of my head, I know the only ride-hailing nonprofit model I know of is Ride Austin. Right. I haven't been following them recently, but that was a ride-hailing service that popped up when Uber and Lyft left the Austin model after some regulations kicked in. They're of course now back in that market. So I don't know how that company is doing, or that effort is doing, but that's the only nonprofit one that I'm aware of. And there are a few car sharing models, one in Minnesota. So I think there are some out there, but I'm not an expert in sort of.
Yeah, here either. I wanted to follow up on one thing that Stan said, and that is I have used that argument as well, that if you look at people's behavior for choices in terms of hailing a TNC, that is, it's not 100% analogous, but it's, I think, reasonably close to what people's choices would be with a automated vehicle hailing. I mean, there's a bit of a difference if there's a driver in the vehicle. So one could see, if indeed the vehicles are fairly expensive and they get in the fleet more in a shared environment rather than as an individually owned environment, one could see the patterns that we're observing in people's preferences also reflected in their usage of automated vehicles. I'm not saying that, but that's sort of one of the things that one of the reasons I personally think it's useful and interesting to study this. I appreciate all the panelists who really shared some insights, and I've certainly learned a lot, and I've enjoyed trying to field the questions that have come in as well. So thank you, everybody.